Hello, and welcome to the Hunting Illinois podcast. With me today, we have Dan Stevens
Hello, hello.
and Curtis Twellman.
Hi, everybody.
So today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about trapping. And so this is something that we haven't really gotten into yet as a program, but we're going to start dipping our toe into it more and possibly be offering some workshops and things like that come wintertime. And so this is kind of our first intro into the trapping realm of hunting in Illinois. And so to start this off, I thought maybe we just go around and talk about the experiences we've had so far with trapping. So I can go first because I'm the novice of the group.
Sure.
So I really just never got into it. My dad, when they were kids, I grew up in Pennsylvania. So when they were younger, my dad and his brothers, he had 5 brothers, so they trapped throughout their teens. But then I always heard stories about it growing up. And then by the time I was born, they had sold all their equipment and just kind of stopped trapping, which I think happened to a lot of people back between the 70s to the 90s.
Sure.
So I was always exposed to it romantically through my dad's stories or through media. You always see it in movies.
Yeah.
Like the mountain man
Big
coming
beard.
out. The guy dressed in all the furs and things. So all the romantic aspect, even though it probably wasn't that fun of a time to be a mountain man, but as a kid, you think that that's like the dream. But so that was kind of my exposure to it. So I really just never got into it. When I became a teen, I asked my dad if I could get into it, and he's just like, "Sure, go pay for a bunch of traps." And I just never had that cash laying around to go out and buy equipment.
It's not cheap to get started. Yeah.
So
You didn't think
that
the
was just kind of
Revenant looked fun?
So I just never got into it personally, and I just I kind of regret it a little bit, but
Sure.
it's definitely a skill I'd like to learn more about.
That's fair. And
Yeah.
I kind of come at it from a similar perspective, but a little bit different. I kind of grew up in the same style of household. My dad, as a young man, he did a lot of trapping and stuff on the river, sold furs just to get some cigar money, as he described it. But when I was growing up, we didn't do a ton of hunting and trapping related activities. My dad wasn't a big hunter, and we didn't really start getting into hunting until I was about 15 or 16. And so at that point, for us, it was like, hey, we were big anglers. We went up to Canada every summer, did a big fishing trip, going after pike and smallmouth, and there just wasn't a lot of time. Obviously we're all in sports and things like that. So it was never, we don't want to trap, or we didn't have an interest in it. And in a lot of cases, it was just time. Obviously resources, like you mentioned, every time you start a new hobby, that hobby gets quite expensive right off the get-go.
Yep.
But for me, I think it's a really interesting perspective on kind of just wildlife and outdoor recreation. And I will go ahead and say some of the best wildlife ecologists I've ever met are trappers. Curtis is a good example of that. With hunting, if you're firearm hunting for deer, in a state that allows rifle hunting, you only have to get within a few hundred yards of that animal. Where with archery, now you're at maybe 30 yards. With trapping, you might be trying to get that individual critter to put his foot in an area that big. And so, just dealing with trappers and understanding the value that they see in understanding animal behavior, animal movement, and ecology, I just think it makes them a really special resource for outdoors people, just because, again, the breadth of knowledge they have of being able to convince a wild animal to step in one little itty spot. So I've always had an affinity for it. I did a little bit of trapping through college. My first exposure to it, I did some work with USDA APHIS and doing some wild pig removal. And so that kind of got me really interested in kind of this trapping mindset. And after that, I went out and started doing kind of the normal fur bear trapping. So, going after beavers and stuff was kind of our big hunt. So I was able to trap a few beavers in my past.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And then we have Curtis, who is our resident expert in trapping. So Curtis, you want to talk a little bit about your background and then also some of the work you've done as an adult?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, expert is a strong word. I always say
Resident expert. Of the 3 of us, you're the expert.
Yeah, it's the best trapper in this group, right?
Yep.
So no, I mean, I've was lucky enough to be able to get into trapping pretty early. It was something that my dad and uncles did. What you guys were alluding to was the fur boom of the late 70s, where a whole bunch of people got into trapping because very common critters like raccoons were selling for $59 averages, and that's in 1979 dollars. And I'm not great at math, but just some quick calculation, considering inflation, I think that's equivalent to like $1.4 million today. Don't check that math, but
It's a lot of
it's pretty.
cigars for
I
your
might
dad,
have put
man.
the decimal in the wrong place or something, but anyway, it's a lot. So a lot of people got into it then. Um, but yeah, luckily my family stayed in it, and it was something I got to do as a kid, and something that really helped me when I was in college because it coincided with another little fur boom that I like to call the Muskrat Boom of 2012, which was, I don't know, about a 4 or 5 year period there where all of a sudden muskrats were bringing over $10 a piece, which is really good for basically something in the mouse family that reproduces up to 3 times per year with really large litter sizes. I mean, just incredibly reproductive. The reproductive output potential of muskrats is about as high as any critter you can think of. So, an awesome critter to be worth over $10 a piece.
Yeah.
Easy to skin too, and great. And that was super helpful in college because, as you guys know, those are lean years
Yeah.
financial. So, but yeah, and then professionally, I got to work in nuisance trapping. So, trapping basically around people's homes when fur bearers would invade. A lot of times it would be raccoons or it could be squirrels, possums, woodchucks, anything like that. And then once I graduated college, I actually worked in research trapping with island foxes out on the Channel Islands of California, and then also trapping to preserve endangered species, which would be least terns and snowy plovers in California. I trapped around their nesting colonies, and a really interesting story, just a very brief explanation about that. Southern California is where these birds nest on the beach. So some of the most expensive real estate in the entire world, right? It's almost all developed. So what used to be just miles and miles of what was nesting ground has been reduced to very, very tiny beaches, and they all have to nest communally. And one predator, like a coyote or a raccoon running through at night, can decimate the entire year's production. So,
Wow.
the Department of Defense, I was actually employed by the Department of Defense. They spend money keeping these beaches that still do house the terns and plovers, keeping them productive because if they lose them, they're the last ones
Sure.
left in the
Sure.
world. So I got to see trapping from that side as well. So yeah, I've been very fortunate to get to do a lot of different trapping around. And then of course in Wisconsin, I was the trapper education coordinator for the DNR, which was really fun and got me out in trapper education classes and getting to do a lot of talking about trapping and teaching new trappers. So a lot of fun stuff. And I always credit trapping as much as anything as far as getting me involved in wildlife and the outdoors. And it's just like you said, Dan, it's nothing, no type of hunting requires you to get in the mind of the critter like trapping does. And like that was almost like an aha moment when I'm out there doing stuff and I started saying, oh, a raccoon's going to jump up here and work this set from a high.
Sure.
And I'm just thinking, like, how in the heck do I know what a raccoon wants to do? And I'm like, that's kind of cool, and that's the kind of stuff that you just pick up from being out there and seeing it. And another thing you got to remember about trappers that's different than hunting, you have to be there every day. Most states, Midwestern states, you've got the daily trap check laws. You're out there every day. It doesn't matter if it snows, if it rains, if the weather's poor. If you're not feeling great, you still got to run your set. So just forcing you to be out there all the time gets you in front of more experiences and gets you to see more stuff when everybody else stays at home because the weather's bad and you push out there. More often than not, I've found that you're rewarded with something cool. So
Sure.
yeah, it's worth it to push out there, but yeah, trapping's one of my favorites for sure. And if you're mentioning trapping movies, you got to talk about The Pinnacle, right? Robert Redford, Jeremiah Johnson,
Such a
Mhm.
classic.
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 Yeah, so clearly Curtis has much more breadth experience trapping than we do. But with that, if we just want to kind of go through the history of trapping in North America, and then we'll start there, and then we'll work our way up to modern day, and then talk a little bit more about trapping in Illinois at this point.
For sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, first off, like we got to define trapping, right? It's a very broad definition, but it is one of the oldest forms of hunting. And at its most basic definition, trapping is just using a device to capture something. So we think about this as using a foothold trap or a body grip trap to capture a fur bear, which is what it's used for right now. But throughout the history, this has meant lots of different things. I mean, in early human history, trapping was, setting up deadfalls to catch a lizard that was maybe your meal, So this varies through time. But the history of trapping is really interesting because really it's North American history. And
Mhm.
it's something that almost gets glossed over because there's so much history to cover in school. Like, where do you stop? But really, I feel like you could do a whole year just on the history of the fur trade and barely do it justice. But it goes all the way back to the 1500s, and in the initial stages, only Native Americans were doing the trapping, and it was a trade with European traders, but only only Native Americans were the ones actually pursuing the critters. And that began to change around 1600 when we got the very first fur trading post in North America set up in what's now Quebec.
Mhm.
And from there, it kind of kicked into really what was a violent period. You hear about the Beaver Wars, where entire wars are basically fought over territory that is laden with fur bears. And that's the famous line from the movie Jeremiah Johnson, right? He's always talking about finding the land with beavers the size of buffalo, I think is what he called it. And that's what everybody thought was beyond the next bend in the river, and you got to fight over it, right? So this was big. This was the biggest money export in this country. So I mean, we're not talking small potatoes. Like, this is the actual driver. A lot of our biggest cities, like Chicago and St. Louis, actually started out as fur trading posts. That's how they started, and the roads were the routes that were taken by the people trading furs. So really, really cool stuff. And then you get into the westward expansion, and then we get into that really romantic period that we've kind of talked about. That's like the mountain man era, and this is the time when people would first go to the Rocky Mountains and all those adventures. And of course, we know about we mentioned the Revenant, right? And
Mhm.
and Jim Bridger was in that. Of course, he was the scout that I can't remember what's his name. Hugh Glass was the frontiersman that got mauled by the bear. But anyway, based on a true story. So now today we find it very romantic to look back at that time, but those people didn't live long, and they didn't they
Right.
didn't keep all their eyes and appendages and all that stuff. So a really a rough time to be out there, but for anybody that likes the outdoors, really cool. Anytime you get to read journal entries from people of that period, it's just so cool to hear about the wildlife and all the adventures they encounter out there. But then moving into basically more recent times, it was around 1850 when the fur market started to really decline. And that was multiple reasons for that. One was just unregulated take now for a couple centuries, right? We had absolutely no hunting or trapping regulations. It was just, hey, we'll give you money for this stuff, go get it,
Mhm.
and all bets were off. I mean, you could drain a pond and blow up the beaver lodge and just collect them, spear them. It's actually steel. What we think of as steel traps of today weren't even widely available until 1823. So they didn't even really play a part in anything up until that.
Wow.
They weren't mass produced and available. So people were building deadfalls, making little simple snares out of wire, straight up spearing critters. I mean, any way you could capture
Sure.
them was fair game. Then, beginning around 1900, a little after 1900, is a period we know a lot about. This is the period of conservation. It's where all the folks, all the outdoors people, and nature lovers, and just people that generally like the outdoors got together and decided that conservation was something we believed in. And it started the era of regulated hunting and trapping. And this is a completely different thing, right? So people are still out there trying to hunt and trap animals, but now we've got basically science-based seasons and controls on methods that are built in to make sure that that take is sustainable. And this should not be compared to anything that happened before the era of conservation, because that's not hunting and trapping. That's basically extermination.
Extermination.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a whole different philosophy. So, yeah, it was a bad time, the period of extermination. Obviously, we lost the passenger pigeon, the Labrador duck, the heath hen, a few other species tossed in there, and species like bobcat, river otter, American martin. These species with lower reproductive potential, but higher values in terms of pelts, they really got hammered and decimated and pushed out a lot of what was their former range. And but it is important to note that was from unregulated take, not from regulated hunting and trapping. Since
Mhm.
the advent of regulated hunting and trapping, those activities have never led to a species becoming endangered or extinct. So really good track record there. And then even to take it one step further, here over the past 30 years or so, we're kind of in the BMP era of trapping. And BMP stands for the best management practice. And it's almost this level beyond the era of conservation or of regulated take. And it's where also ethics are taken into account. And basically the humaneness of the capture methods that are used. So really cool stuff, really awesome. And I feel like basically any period in the history that I just mentioned, we could spend a whole hour talking about.
Mhm.
But in a nutshell, that's kind of what's got us here to today. And so a lot of people might ask the question, is the fur trade still relevant today? Is trapping still relevant today? And that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit in this podcast. So I don't know, you guys got anything to add in that
Yeah,
while
I'll
we're
kind
here?
of jump in with a little recommendation. Obviously, we're not a book club. Maybe we should start one at some
Hey,
point. That could be kind of fun.
we could actually new segment, book club segment. Go ahead, Dan.
But there's this really interesting book that I read. It was probably about a year and a half ago that I've read it now, but it's called Fur, Fortune, and Empire. It's a really interesting look into the history of trapping in North America, and it really talks about a lot of the ideas that Curtis kind of just discussed, but dives into them with a little bit more nuanced details. It's a very good written book, and it's won numerous awards. It got an Outdoor Writers Award. It got some other Historical Society awards. And so it's a really well put together book. So if you're interested in kind of diving a little bit deeper into the history and how it really did, like Curtis said, fur trapping really did shape America. Check out that book, Fur, Fortune, and Empire. It's by Eric J. Dolan. Check it out. And Curtis, you may have some other recommendations too that you want to highlight, but definitely a good one. I enjoyed that read.
Cool.
Yeah, I definitely have read some really cool, even just Undaunted Courage, which I can't remember who wrote that, but it's the basically a bunch of excerpts from the Lewis and Clark expedition. There's
Oh,
a lot
cool.
of cool stuff in there. And yeah, I've read just Jim Bridgers, any of the like field notes things that try to put together some of his adventures are really
Mhm.
cool. But it was such a fascinating time,
It really is. Yeah,
Mhm.
so different than today.
definitely.
But since we're talking about today, I'll go ahead and so what's the state of the fur market today? And there is still a fur market today. It does still exist. A lot of people don't know that. But it's been characterized by a lot of instability here in the past couple years. So I mentioned like around 2012, we had a little bit of a boom where muskrats were doing really good. After that, it moved to coyotes, where coyotes started selling really well. But we were riding what was a pretty nice resurgence of the fur market for a few years there, and then due to a number of issues. NAFA, which is the North American Fur Auctions, which was the largest North American fur auction house, went bankrupt and had to sell all their assets. And
Mm,
it was, yeah, it was a big thing, and it threw this giant monkey wrench in basically the worldwide fur market. And then add COVID, and all of a sudden, all these
yeah,
auctions that used to take place in Canada, where people from all these different countries would come and buy big volumes of fur, they were done online. And the thing about auctions online for things such as they don't work. People need to feel it. They need to see it. You can't judge the quality by a picture, and so yeah, all of those things led to a lot of instability, and so it's questionable now. I definitely trapper people that go out there and trap are not doing it to make money. Even the past 10 or 15 years, when we've had good years, it's really rare to be able to make enough to pay for all your time and gas and
sure. Hmm.
everything like that, if you were really to come down, but to count it down. But you don't get paid for the other activities you do, right? We don't get paid for deer hunting or
Hmm.
going out and playing disc golf or bird watching or anything that you want to do. So um yeah, that part of it, that financial aspect, doesn't really play in most modern trappers. We still utilize the fur market because that's how you utilize what you catch a lot of times, making the most use out of it. And a lot of the fur market is stuff that people wouldn't even think about. I mean, when you think about the fur market, most people are thinking a high fashion, right?
Hmm.
Maybe
Hmm.
Cruella DeVille coming out there with the Dalmatian vest or something. And really, that's a small part of fur utilization. The biggest use of fur for a long time has been utilitarian use. So a lot of times that's lining the inside of a jacket with fur to make it much more, warm. And so it's hard to argue that that's for fashion when it's on the inside and nobody can see it. Um, Other big uses are brushes. Most people don't know that if you get a high quality art brush, it's made out of real fur. A lot of times it's sable fur, which would be American marten, could be counted as sable fur, and then also Russian sable. But that's real fur. And so you'll find fur used in a lot of places where you don't think so. Also, makeup brushes, anything like that, real fur outperforms synthetic fibers far superior. So much so that I've even heard of vegans who have completely switched around because they're also artists and they can't use inferior
Ah,
brushes. And so they're like, well, I guess I'm not vegan anymore
interesting.
because
Yeah.
I
No,
heard
I
that.
think that's a whole cool little topic is just the different uses and the distinctions between each fur type. And I'm sure some of that probably dictates fair market value of said fur, at an auction and things. But what are some of the really, because I know, in some cases you might have a fur that's more waterproof than others. So that might be, a little more advantageous than, let's say, a coyote pelter or something to that effect. Does that impact price a lot, or is a lot of the price dictated by supply and demand more so than the utility of that fur?
No, definitely utility plays a big part. Because, for example, like raccoon is so heavy that it has never sold well in China. China is one of the
Okay,
biggest fur buyers out there, but it just doesn't get cold enough to need a fur as heavy as raccoon.
interesting.
So they prefer mink and muskrat because it's more suitable for the winters in China. Now, if you get
Uh,
up into the middle of Siberia, like those folks want raccoon.
Yeah.
They want the heaviest they can get. But yeah, utility definitely plays a big part. And some for like for example, beaver is incredibly tough. It's strong. So when you make a garment out of beaver, it said that's probably going to last 3 lifetimes. So
Wow.
somebody can wear that for their whole life, pass it down to their kid. Their kid can probably wear it for their whole life too. And then maybe it's junk the third generation down. But There's not too many garments that are out there that you can say that for.
No.
And yeah, heavy fur like beaver, that's what it is. So it's a long-term coat.
Cool.
Hmm. So, if someone's thinking about getting into trapping, I mean, would they be trying to sell those furs off, or are people getting more handy around the house and they're trying to build their own garments with the fur, or what would be like a goal that someone would have as a first-time trapper?
For sure. And yeah, I say as a first-time trapper, like start very small. People think like, oh, if I'm going to get into trapping, I've got to have, 24 to 50 traps and I've got to set up all this big line. Like, you don't have to do that. If you have just a couple, whatever, a handful, 6 foothold traps or body grip traps that you can get out and get started with, do that. And then I recommend personal utilization right now because the fur market is low and you're going to be kind of learning how to do everything. So this is a great time for personal utilization. You can get your fur tanned. There's a tannery I really like in Iowa called Sleepy Creek Tannery. They don't charge that much. I haven't looked at the prices in a little while, but for most animals, it's somewhere around 30 or $35 to tan it. And it comes back, I mean, professional quality, super soft, really good. Once you have it tanned, then you can make stuff out of it. If you're
Mhm.
handy, you can sew stuff up yourself. If you're not handy, there are people called furriers that will make stuff for you. I know in Wisconsin, where I was last, there's a guy named Don Bierman. He has a shop called I think it's Wild Things Fur. And another friend of mine, Sky Good, she's got a shop called Barefoot Furs. Both of them will take your own furs that you've got tanned and make a custom, basically whatever you want. If you want a mountain man style hat, going rate 60 to $100 to get that sewn up. It's not cheap by any means, but when you think that that hat may last 2 generations, you may be
Right.
handing that down, and your kid might be, bow hunting wearing that muskrat hat,
And
50 years
nobody will
from
have an
now.
identical hat. That's the
No,
cool
yeah,
thing about it
and it's
too.
got a story. You're
You're
wearing
right.
that hat, and
Right.
somebody asks you about it, you're like, "Oh yeah, I caught them muskrats in that pond right over
Hmm.
there," or maybe my dad did, or my grandpa did. I mean, that's pretty cool. So I preach personal utilization. There is
Mhm.
still a fur market, but really, what we need to make sure we're doing is making the most use out of the critter as possible, because
Mhm.
that's one of the common misconceptions about trappers is they're not utilizing what they catch.
Hmm.
And a real trapper is going to make every effort to make the most use out of every animal that's caught.
Oh, more so
Yeah.
than any outdoors person I've ever met. I mean, they'll use parts of it for other bait. They'll use. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, and if you want to talk a little bit about that, Curtis, I know you do this pretty eloquently about popular opinion and hunting. If we had it on a spectrum, we probably have trophy hunting as popular opinion anyway. So trophy hunting is probably the least popular, and then hunting for food, I believe, is like 80% of
About
70.
78% of
Yeah,
Americans.
70,
Yeah.
80% of Americans, as long as you're eating what you're hunting,
Hmm.
don't mind it. So then, where does trapping fall on that line? And then, in your opinion, where should it fall?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And the big issue is I think most people have sort of come to this conclusion that food is greater than warmth. And so the only legitimate purpose for animals is if you eat them. That's it. And while I understand that, it's just, if you look at the whole picture, it's just not correct. There's certainly other things that you can use an animal for. And when we're talking about fur bearers especially, a lot of times, and I'm a good example of this, most of my trapping is aimed at nuisance critters. I use it as a way to obtain hunting permission on a property or to do favors for a landowner, that sort of thing. So basically, these are animals that have already done something that has made the landowner mad. He or she is going to take them out some which way or how. If I know if I can get in there and trap them, I can at least make the most utilization out of them as possible rather than a landowner just seeing what he or she considers to be a pest and dispatching it. So I think trappers, like Dan said, make excellent utilization out of their animals, and I feel like that they should be right there with the people who hunt for food. As long as you are taking an animal for a legitimate purpose, I'm not sure that it matters if it's strictly for eating or if it's strictly for providing a fur garment that's going to keep you warm for potentially 3 generations, or whether it's because that particular animal raided a landowner's chicken coop. All of those things are legitimate reasons for me. And when you can combine them, that's all the better.
Mhm.
And when it comes to fur bears like beaver, hey, you get the best of both worlds. You get one of the best wild game meats out there. They're basically like little, floating cows out there in the water,
And
and they're
the
just
meat has a
there
nice nutty flavor to it as well.
for everybody to eat. They fit in most smokers, even though
Mhm.
they're pretty big. They're fusiform, right? So they're shaped like a torpedo. So they fit well in barbecue grills. Just an insider tip there. But yeah, not only that, you get the food, you get also the pelt, obviously. But then with beaver, you get the glands. You get castor glands, which can sell for as much as the pelt and are used in things like new car smell and vanilla and different berry scents and flavors. You can even find some beers and some exotic
Ah,
liquors that are flavored with beaver castor, and yeah, so it is
interesting.
a food additive as
Mhm.
well. But then you also have one of the coolest skulls in the whole animal kingdom. That if you go ahead and boil up that skull, get rid of the meat, prepare that. I mean, there's no skull cooler than a beaver
No,
skull.
no.
Big, they got the giant big rodent teeth sticking out the front. I mean, it's a great conversation piece. So, yeah, you can really use them from head to tail. I even know people that sell the feet. You can sell the feet to people who dry them out and make keychains out of them, or back scratchers.
Oh,
Beaver foot
sure.
back scratchers.
That would be fun.
And the
Yeah.
tails, sell the tails. Ice fishermen buy the tails. They cut little slivers out to use when they're fishing. Also, other people buy the tails to make leather goods out of the leather scaly covering is
Mhm.
super tough. I know a trapper in Wisconsin, Dan Carroll, one of the best cable restraint guys in the world. He's got a beaver tail wallet that's older than me. It looks better than my leather wallet. That's like
Wow,
30 years
that's
old.
cool.
Mhm.
So
And I mean,
yeah,
everything you're saying, it's all game utilization. So you might sound like a creepy guy who wants to scratch his back with a beaver foot, but if you're taking a life, you might as well get as much use of that as you possibly can. So on that spectrum, I would say that trapping's even above hunting something for food
For a
because
lot of people,
just
yes.
longevity wise too. I mean, you get a meal, you get a deer, you get meal for 6 months, depending on how big your family is, maybe a year. I don't know, and how big the deer is.
Mhm.
But you get one of these hats, like he said, you could have a hat for generations. I mean, how many estate sales have you been to and see a old mink coat in the
Mhm.
closet that's still marked at 2 grand? And those minks were taken for their fur, but they're still being utilized like 50 years
To this
later
day, yeah.
to, I mean, and continuing, and they're in good shape. So, I mean, it's like almost the most conservation way of hunting or trapping is really this trapping.
Sure. I mean, just think of the number of hunters that we interact with on a week by week basis. How many of those individuals, and I'm not faulting them, I'm in the same boat. How many of us, when we shoot a squirrel, when we shoot a deer, do we take the pelt or every little piece? We don't.
Hmm.
And so I think that's a really interesting perspective on things.
Absolutely.
And kind of following along that same trend, I know a little bit about some common misconceptions, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but there's these big questions about humaneness and this, oh, trapping is so indiscriminatory. You're just setting out footholds, and whatever comes around and steps in it, you catch. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I know you brought up, some of these BMPs or best management practices and how they've done a lot of research looking at these things to make them, as efficient as possible at the targeted species. So could you just kind of dive into that concept a little bit?
Hmm.
for sure. Yeah. First, like just kind of air out the dirty laundry, like the
Mhm.
common misconceptions that we hear, you basically touched on all of them, that trapping is inhumane, that it's indiscriminate, that it decimates wildlife populations, and that trappers don't utilize what they catch. Well, we've kind of already talked about utilization and that aspect of it. But when we get into the others, yeah, we really have to start diving into the BMPs. So first off, let me just explain the BMPs and the best management practices of trapping. This is a undertaking that has been going on for over 20 years now, but it's being done by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So we call them AFWA. AFWA. Um, so you can find all this information online if you search AFWA or the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, keyword fur bear. All this stuff will come up. You can also search BMPs or trapping, and it'll come up as well. But they've to date started in 97. They've done 600 different trap types tested on 23 different species,
Wow.
and really, this has become one of the largest wildlife centered research projects ever done because it's still ongoing to this day. It's still getting updated. And how they do this is really ingenious. So, just to take you back real quick, like back in the 90s, animal rights activists were making these big pushes saying how trapping was really bad. And a lot of it was centered in Europe. Now, Europe had completely decimated their fur bear populations for a number of reasons, mostly unregulated take and the fact that wildlife belongs to landowners. So anything deemed a pest is just indiscriminately killed. So they were really, really concerned that we were going to do the same thing in North America, even though we operate a completely different system. But that's beside the point. They don't need to have sense in their reasoning, but they were pushing big. And in the early 90s, they almost got the European Union to basically withdraw from the fur market, which
Mm,
would have all but killed the fur market back then because that most a lot of things, at least the fashion side, were going through Italy and some of the bigger European fashion countries like that. So this was a pretty big deal. And basically, there was a compromise that was rendered that instead of the European Union just dropping out of the fur trade, they would make every country who's a part of the fur trade create basically a system to test the humaneness of trapping. And at the time, they kind of thought that they just wouldn't be able to do this, or that maybe they would do it and everything would fail and it would be the end of trapping as we know it. Um, but that didn't happen. So they started testing it. And when I say they, it's the United States and Canada. Canada started testing killer type traps. So we're talking body grip traps. Think a mouse trap, but for mice of all sizes. So the little trap you set for mice in your house, there's a little bit bigger one for muskrats and then a little bit bigger one for beaver. They all operate under the same principle that they want to catch the animal and then kill it as quickly as possible. So Canada has a lab where that's what they test. That's all they test. And they share that data with the US. The US test what are considered the live restraining devices. So these are anything that is designed to catch an animal and then keep it alive and in good condition until you can get there and either dispatch it if you're taking it or release it if you're not taking it. And so we can't do that in a lab. So the way they do it here is they go to states, and I'm sure they've done it in Illinois. I don't know the history because I haven't been here long enough, but in Wisconsin they found just normal trappers, just everyday trappers, and they agree to take part in this BMP testing, and they send a technician out with them. Usually this will be a state wildlife employee, and this person will be the data recorder and then also be the random generator of what traps used. So this trapper will go on his or her normal trap line. When they show up at a spot and he or she says, okay, this is where I want to set a raccoon trap, the technician who's with them will do a random, whatever you want to call it, and say, okay, you're using this trap. So the trapper doesn't get to decide what trap is used where, and that's the trap that they're testing. And then, of course, when they come back and visit, everything is recorded. If they make a capture, then that animal is dispatched and the carcass is immediately frozen and sealed, where it's going to get a complete necropsy with some of the best wildlife vets in the whole country. Sometimes this includes x-rays and radiographs. I mean, it's hardcore stuff, but
Mhm.
they're basically looking for every possible injury that could be from trapping. So they look at obviously the paw that's in the trap. They look at every digit. They look at any, any scrape or any scratch on the skin would be a ding, and these are all scored on a number of points, right? They also look at the teeth. That's another thing. If something's biting at a trap, if it breaks a tooth, that would be a deduction. Of course, any big injury like a break or something like that would be automatic failure. But they go through and score every single injury, and they do this on a number of different animals, and they have compiled this since 97. So we're talking an incredibly robust data set. And basically, almost all of the commonly used capture devices passed with flying colors.
Mm.
Sometimes there's a few devices that need a couple little things to make them pass. Like, for example, a 1.5 coil spring for raccoons. Unmodified, it's not great because there's just too much area there underneath the jaw. But if you put a second jaw on there, or if you put a double jaw or anything to reduce the area between the jaw and the base plate, then all of a sudden it passes with flying colors. So there's slight modifications you can do a lot of these devices to make them better. But most of the widely used stuff passed. And I mentioned originally a lot of the state trappers association groups were worried about the BMPs, and because they thought this was going to be a source of like further regulation. And in reality, the BMPs have led to more regulations being opened up than they have being closed. Because, for example, devices like the cable restraint, which is a specially designed snare, function so well that some states have reached out and they want data from Apple about these devices because they want to start to include them just because they score so highly. So it's really become the friend of the trapper. And
Sure.
anytime trapping is classified as inhumane, all a trapper has to do is point to this BMP data, which is, as I already mentioned, an incredibly robust data set, and it's scored according to ISO standards. So these are international standards of humaneness that are basically equivalent to what's used in agriculture. So, yeah, really, the question of whether or not trapping is humane is kind of it can't be challenged on any large level because these BMPs are so good. And as a part of that, the indiscriminate part also worked in there because they have all the data of what trappers are trying to trap and what they actually trap. And I would have to look at the data, but they found that like catching an off species, so catching something that you're not intending to catch, is an incredibly small percentage of what they actually caught. I want to say it was like 3%. It was a
Sure.
single digit. So a lot of times, either by the device that's used, where it's set, the bait that's used, trappers can be incredibly specific in what can get caught. So
Sure, and
Do,
the cool thing is, just talking about these BMPs, if you are, in a scenario where you're kind of at the other end of that spectrum where you do have an off catch, these BMPs are in place to already, provide you with that fundamental, okay, I'm going to be able to release this animal, it's going to be in good health, it's going to be in good condition, and so it shouldn't, suffer too many long-lasting impacts if you do happen to trap, an indiscriminate animal. But like you said, that's really interesting.
yeah, yeah, just saying basically, the ones that are meant to kill really well, and the ones that are meant to hold really well, and then so trying to get that middle part out
Mhm.
of injuring the animal by accident. But do you think it's more the trapper? No, trapper. Who's at fault? So the trapper is at fault when it comes to the bycatch stuff, or do you think it just happens once in a while? But it's more the trapper more than the trap, like setting it in the wrong spot.
just happens every once in a while.
Mhm.
It's one of those things. Animals are unpredictable.
Yeah, it's wild
One
Yeah.
animals
you
and
know one time I set what was a mink set to me because it was in the water. It was the trap was under the water and I had a little piece of muskrat shoved up under this log. This was back when I was in Missouri. It was a mink set, and I caught a bobcat in it. And
Mm.
like technically, like I kept the bobcat because I could. I was in a zone where I could. It was bobcat season, so I kept it. But technically, that was an off catch because
Mhm.
it was a mink set. Like, did I do anything wrong? No, it's just that cat was hungry enough that he stepped in the water to try to eat that muskrat leg or whatever I
Sure.
Hmm.
had jammed in there. So I definitely think being knowledgeable, you can help yourself to reduce non-target catches immensely. One thing that comes to my mind is the first time I got the Fisher trap in Wisconsin. I was trapping on public land, and it's both rabbit and pheasant season. And I'm trying to catch a fisher in a 160 body grip, which is a killer type trap. And I want to use that around all these dogs. And I did so, but I did so knowing that I had almost a 0% chance of catching any of them. Any ideas on how I did that?
I got nothing. I could guess, but it would be a guess.
I put them up in trees.
Okay, yeah, that's
Fisher climb
I
trees
was
like
gonna say
raccoons.
elevate them, yeah, yeah.
Yep, exactly. So I found little, call them like leaning pole type sets, but I just used it on trees with a slight lean.
Oh,
Put
sure.
my bait up there, hit it so no birds could see it from the top, and put the trap in front of that. And the only way a beagle or a dog could have possibly ever been caught is if they somehow found a way to climb a 4 inch, 5 inch diameter log way up, 6 foot high. So
Sure.
just using little things like that, that when you know about animals, even though the trap itself, sure, the trap itself is going to fire at anything that goes through it. But when you use your knowledge to set it in a way that only certain things are going to get caught in it, now you've made it a discriminate piece of equipment that's, hopefully going to catch what you're after.
And
Hmm.
I think what's really cool about this whole kind of, the conversation around these BMPs is it really highlights how fundamentally, wildlife regulations are founded on science. We hear from a lot of folks that, oh, that regulation is just made up. There's really no reason for it. But this is a prime example of, basically the North American model of conservation and
Hmm.
of wildlife use, and how science is kind of at the forefront of this use, and science is at the forefront of the regulations. And I just think this is a really interesting example of seeing an issue, studying and analyzing that issue, and then implementing these, these adjustments
Hmm.
to resolve that issue. I think that's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and it gets very specific. We're only brushing
Oh,
against it right now,
yeah.
but we've been to stores with Curtis, and he would go through the different the traps that are available on the shelf, and be like, that one has horrible BMPs, that one has good BMPs, but they're all still kind of offered at the same place. Do you have any suggestions for people on how to figure out what trap to pick up?
For sure, yeah. Everybody can look through the BMPs. They're available online. If you search the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, BMPs or fur bears or trapping, they list them all out there by species. You can click on them and read through them, and it's not like technical jargon. It's stuff that you can understand. And
Mhm.
a
Hmm.
lot of times they'll describe traps in multiple different ways. So they could use the actual trap name, like they could say this is an MB 550, but then they can also give you the dimensions and just say it's a foothold trap that's 4 3/4 inches across. So there's multiple different ways to, I guess, understand what they're talking about, even if you're not really up on the trap jargon. You're like, what's an MB 550 or what's a 110? You don't know these numbers. They also will kind of give you the information in a way that's digestible without knowing that sort of insider lingo. So all those are there. 23 different species. You can look through them, and that's a great place to start with trap recommendations. And I always recommend used traps. Always buy the used traps. So much better. When you buy a new trap, you are many, many hours of work away from being able to set that thing usually. If you buy a used trap, all that's done, and a trap should last a lifetime. So all the state uh, associations, the Illinois Trappers Association's no different. They all have state rendezvous, and there'll always be trap dealers and just people set up with tailgates that are selling used traps. That's the best place to get them for sure.
Yeah, so what you're alluding to is that there's a lot of treatment that you do to the trap before you set it out that makes sure it doesn't like rust up over time and everything else, right?
For sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
and just to adjust it so it's working properly, tuned up. That's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, we're
Sure.
getting that. I know we're trying to discard this. So if you're interested, is there anything else before I close out?
Well, I think just since Dan mentioned kind of the science aspect, we also have to mention how big of an ally trappers and trapping have been to wildlife scientists. And I can't say that enough. Like the opportunity, especially when it comes to foothold traps, where you can get some of the most elusive animals in our country, like bobcats, you can get them in your hand and you can take measurements, you can give them immunizations, you can put radio collars on them, and you can let them go and they live. Like that is an amazing tool for wildlife
Yes.
managers. And it really, nothing other than trapping can supply that. And a lot of times people are finding that the your common everyday trappers in your state, they're the best trappers out there. So they do it better than wildlife biologists a lot of times. And so you see a lot of state agencies that just work with private trappers. I know in Wisconsin, a big push, they would just put the information out there that if you catch a bobcat that you don't have a tag for, call up the DNR, we'll come out and put a collar on it, and you'll get to do this whole experience, and then we'll send you points for the cat. And it was a big hit. And through this, Wisconsin to date has collared more than 100 bobcats caught by normal everyday trappers in foothold traps. More than 100. They've come out, and usually it takes them a while to get out there. So this is a longer amount of time in the trap than a trapper would normally have the animal in there. They do the full workup, they put the collar on them. Even with that, with a sample size of over 100, they've never had a trap related mortality.
That's impressive.
Mhm.
Amazing.
That
You,
is
you
that
won't
is
see those numbers with a miss net. If you miss
no.
birds
Oh
or
yeah.
bats, you're probably going to lose a couple out of 100. It's
Yep.
just
That was about our average. I've
yeah.
done, mist netting for songbirds, rocket netting for turkey, traps for quail. I've caught, cottonmouths for wildlife research, deer. There's always a little bit of capture mortality or capture myopathy. So that's really fascinating that not a single one from something that most people who are outside of, the hunting and trapping perspective would call inhumane. Would just
Mhm.
Yeah.
that would be what a lot of the public would deem that as. And the fact that there's that's very fascinating. That's cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. Most of the
Yeah.
times you can't even tell what paw is in the trap.
Sure.
I
Sure.
went out with that group and I didn't catch any bobcats, but I did catch one coyote when I was with them. And, yeah, you take the paw out of the trap and then after a while you're like, oh, which one was in there?
Right.
Because you always
Wow.
check it and make sure that it's fine.
Sure.
But yeah, and not to say that injuries never happen,
Yes.
it's
Right.
it's things when you're hunting and trapping can always happen. Mistakes
Yes.
can happen, but using the right equipment and going about it the right way, you can cut a lot of those mistakes out and really make trapping, I mean, not only humane and something that you can get a lot of utilization out of the animals, but like I mentioned before, use it as a foot in the door to get deer hunting permission or turkey hunting permission. We all
Yeah.
know how hard it is to get that stuff. When you can offer an actual service to a landowner, it becomes a lot easier. If you see they've got a ditch with water coming up over their road and they're throwing beaver sticks out of the culvert, that's a perfect time to say, hey, I happen to be a trapper, I could trap these beaver for you. Well, how much do you want to get paid? I don't need any money, but
Give me that back 40.
I
Uh-huh.
wouldn't mind squirrel hunting back there later this year. Most of the time, those folks are gonna be super
Yeah.
happy that you
Yeah.
offered that trade.
And to put more perspective on that, I mean, I live in the HOA in town here, and we don't have hunting opportunities, but we do have a 6-acre lake, and we've had beaver in there, and I think the extermination we didn't get the beaver, but the trapper came out and tried to trap them. We think it moved on, but that was about $500. And then we have muskrats that are damaging our shoreline. That, I mean, the one side of it is just falling, like feet of it are falling into the lake because of the muskrat holes that are all over it. And to get that repaired is gonna probably, the last time we got a quote, which was 5 years ago, and they didn't do anything about it, was about $250,000 to get riprap around the whole shoreline of the lake. So I'm getting a new quote this summer, and we'll see what that turns out to be. But these are real problems. Like saying a nuisance animal, you can say it really fast, and people might not truly understand the price that people need to pay to mitigate these problems.
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind, just like you said, the aspect in wildlife management that trapping plays. And yeah, trapping is everything is designed so that we can't over harvest and we can't decimate the populations. But yeah, it's nice when a lake does have problems like that. If you can offer it up to a local trapper who can come out there and do something that oftentimes they're willing to do for free
Hmm.
during the trapping season, that's a legitimate resource. And it's also the reason why, even if like private trapping doesn't exist, these animals are still going to die. Just
Right.
look at the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a famous example where they don't allow their citizens to trap, but they have government funding trapping programs because much of their country exists below sea level, and they've got muskrats and beaver. So the animals have to die, but since they're not taken by trappers in the Netherlands, they're thrown away. In
Mhm.
Hmm.
America, they're made into hats that last 2 to 3 generations. So I mean, you tell me what's the better route.
Sure,
Hmm.
sure.
Sure. All right. With that, is there anything else that we want to talk about before we move on?
I don't think so.
Let us know
Just
if you're
want to
interested in this
encourage
topic.
people to look out for our trapping workshops that will
Yeah.
be coming this winter. Because if you've ever had an interest, getting into trapping will make you a better outdoors person for sure, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So keep a lookout for those.
And the cool thing is, if you're a hunter, that gives you a lot more time to spend outdoors throughout the winter. If
Hmm.
you're just your standard hunter, you may wrap up deer hunting by Christmas.
Yeah.
If you become a trapper, you have just really expanded the different, outdoor activities you can
Sure.
participate in throughout the winter.
Oh, yeah, Christmas. That's when the coyote trapping gets good.
Right, right.
Then after
Yeah.
that, you got the beaver and the muskrats. So
Yep.
And
yeah.
also, I mean, if you have an inspiring uh, wildlife biologist in your family and they want to learn we have the weirdest resumes of any industry that I know of. And I mean, like I learned how to scuba dive because I knew when I was going to go to graduate school, I needed to scuba dive for my research. So we do all kinds of things on the side for our research. So anyone who has a teenager or something who's looking into becoming a wildlife biologist, go out and start trapping now, and you'll have a step ahead of everyone else when you get out in the field.
Yeah, who knows? You might wind up on San Clemente Island, trapping some of the cute little island foxes and immunizing them against canine distemper, which is
Hmm.
Hmm.
pretty dang cool. That's what they look for. They look for people who have trapping experience because that's what the job is.
Yep.
Yep.
It's not hard to jab a needle in a fox and give them some solution, but getting them in the trap is the tougher part.
No, absolutely. So with that, we can move on to critter trivia.
Yeah.
All right. So last podcast we talked about how to prepare for the harvest and safe transport of meat back home, and we asked when does bacteria grow and the temperature at which bacteria
Hmm.
grows. And the temperature is the rule of thumb is going to be 40 degrees. So anything above 40 degrees, you're going to get that bacterial growth. So anytime that it's warmer than that outside, try to get it home as quick as you can. As long as you do it in a timely manner, you should be fine. But
And it's really important to know that even if you're not a hunter, an outdoorsman, or
Yeah.
fisher, whatever, just knowing that in terms of food safety is huge.
Yeah.
I know we all get lazy at times. We all forget to thaw out a hamburger for dinner and then we go throw it on the counter. Well, what's above the counter? It's probably above 40 degrees.
Yeah.
So you're not necessarily, setting yourself up in the best possible way to thaw out the meat. So even if you're not, thinking of outside temperatures after you harvest, it's just as important as, preparation in the kitchen and packaging and just always trying to make sure that you're, below that 40 degrees. And that's why thawing out in the fridge is kind of the ideal scenario because that's between that nice temperature between freezing and 40 where things will thaw out nice and safe.
So do we have a question for this week?
Well, I'm hungry for a hamburger now. But I do
Beaver
got a
burger?
question. So, since we're talking about trapping, we're talking about North America here. Why not just go with what is the largest rodent in North America, which makes it the second largest rodent in the world, but the largest rodent in North America? And then the bonus question is, what is Illinois' only native marsupial?
Good
And both
question.
of these are kind of related to trapping and the fur trade and all that stuff. So yeah, it's a two-parter.
I like it.
Awesome.
I like it.
Yeah, well, we hope you enjoyed learning about trapping today. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg for this. Curtis did a great job of skimming over the different topics there. I know we could talk about each one of those for a very long time. So thank you, and we'll see you guys next time.